wife had strictly forbidden me from setting foot in her vineyard. After she passed away, the lawyer placed a key in my hand and said, "This secret belongs to you now." I was planning to sell the land because I didn't think I was strong enough to handle it, but out of curiosity, I decided to go see it first. When I opened the gate and stepped inside, I was shocked, almost breathless. Inside, I discovered a shield my wife had already put in place to protect me from the wolf living within our own family. Before I step through that door and uncover who the wolf truly is, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this story from? Comment your city or country below. Subscribe to follow this journey. This is a fictional story dramatized to create meaningful and valuable reflections. I, Thane Garrison, a 59-year-old retired bridge inspector, sat in the sterile silence of the lawyer's office, my calloused hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk as I stared at the key that would change everything. The air in the room was heavy thick with the smell of toner and the clinical dust of old files. Across from me sat Gregory Wilson, a man whose skin looked like parchment and who had been our family attorney since Brooke was in diapers, adjusting his spectacles with a tremble that wasn't there a year ago. It had been 3 months since the funeral, 3 months since the light of my life. Rebecca was extinguished in a pileup on Highway 101. I expected today to be a somber exercise in closing bank accounts and signing off on the small Portland bungalow we had shared for 33 years. I did not expect the weight of a secret. Gregory cleared his throat, the sound rasping in the quiet office. "There is one final item, Mr. Garrison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something your wife insisted be kept in a separate trust until this specific date." I frowned, my defensive instincts as an engineer kicking in. "Rebecca didn't have separate accounts." "Gregory," I replied, my voice reflecting a growing reflective anger. "We were transparent about everything. In our marriage, we didn't just share a bed. We shared every blueprint, every debt, and every dream. Or so I had believed. 33 years. You think you know the person sleeping 3 inches away from you until a lawyer hands you a key to a life you never shared." Gregory didn't argue. He simply slid a heavy manila folder across the polished mahogany. The weight of it was substantial, a physical manifestation of a truth I wasn't prepared to hold. I opened it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Inside was a deed, but not for anything in Oregon. It was for Heritage Hills, a 45-acre vineyard in Napa Valley, California. The purchase price listed was $5 million paid in full 5 years ago, using her family inheritance. I stared at the signature, the elegant script I had seen on 1,000 grocery lists and birthday cards. She had been leading a massive financial and physical second life in California while still making dinner for me every night at 6. How do you archive a secret that spans state lines and millions of dollars while still making dinner every night at 6? I looked up at Gregory, my vision blurring. "She bought this 5 years ago, in secret?" I asked. Gregory reached out, placing a withered hand near the folder. "She wasn't hiding it from you, Thane," he said softly. "She was building it for you. She knew you were retiring soon from the bridge inspections, and she wanted you to have something that wouldn't rust or crack." But as I read further, the twist tightened its grip. This wasn't just a plot of dirt or a retirement hobby. The deed represented a transfer of a multi-million-dollar business that was already operational, staffed, and currently waiting for my command. The woman I buried 3 months ago had built an empire in the shadows of our quiet life. As my thumb traced the cool brass of the antique key, I realized the woman I buried 3 months ago was a stranger I was only just beginning to meet. The hum of the jet engine vibrated through the armrest, a constant low-frequency roar that matched the churning in my gut as Portland vanished beneath a thick blanket of gray clouds. I was strapped into seat 4A, the antique brass key, still a heavy cold weight in my pocket, pressing against my thigh, as if to remind me that the world I knew had ended long before the funeral. I pulled the heavy manila folder from my carry-on, the edges already slightly frayed from my frantic handling over the last 12 hours. As I unfolded the deed to Heritage Hills, a small, yellowed, handwritten sticky note fluttered from the fine print of the legal jargon. It was in her handwriting, those precise, elegant loops I knew better than my own name. It read, "Don't trust the soil until you've tasted the cellar." My wife, Rebecca Garrison, had always been a woman of quiet mysteries. Her 33 years by my side spent as a dedicated rare books archivist who, it seemed, had archived one final secret for me. I stared out the window at the endless expanse of white mist, feeling a sharp, biting sense of self-reproach. For 5 years she had taken these quarterly trips to California. Just another trip to the Berkeley archives, Thane, she'd said every single time with that soft, reassuring smile. I was a fool to believe it was just paper and ink. I had been so preoccupied with inspecting the structural integrity of the interstate bridges, so focused on the tiny fractures in steel and concrete, that I had missed the tectonic shift happening in my own marriage. Marriage is supposed to be a shared map, but Rebecca had been redrawing the borders in invisible ink, while I was busy inspecting bridges for cracks. We had sat at the same table, shared the same bed, and yet she was managing a $5 million empire, while I was worrying about the cost of a new water heater. The betrayal felt less like a blow, and more like a slow, freezing tide rising around my ankles. My mind drifted back, pulled by the scent of jet fuel and the cabin's recycled air, to a rainy Tuesday night in October 5 years ago. Rebecca had come home later than usual, her eyes unusually intense, bright, with a mixture of terror and hope that I hadn't understood then. She had gripped my hands, her fingers trembling. "Promise me, Thane," she had whispered, her voice cracking with a weight I couldn't identify. "Never go to Heritage Hills. Not yet. Promise me on our 33 years that you won't go looking for the legacy before I finish the archive." I had laughed it off, kissing her forehead. "I promise, Beck," I'd said. "But what are you so afraid of?" She hadn't answered, only clung to me as if the house were about to be swept away. "Have you ever looked at a photo of someone you loved for decades and realized the person in the frame was wearing a mask you helped them forge?" As the plane began its long, tilting descent toward the San Francisco tarmac, the final part of her warning echoed in my skull like a siren. She wasn't just afraid of me seeing the vineyard. She was afraid of someone else finding out it existed. The landing gear locked into place with a mechanical thud, but the real impact was the memory of the look in Rebecca's eyes, the look of a woman who was building a fortress, not just a vineyard. The tires of my rental car transitioned from smooth asphalt to the rhythmic, bone-deep crunch of expensive Riverstone gravel as the iron gates of Heritage Hills groaned open for the first time in my life. I had spent the last hour driving through the winding, sun-drenched corridors of Napa Valley, my hands slick against the steering wheel, as the GPS guided me toward coordinates I still didn't believe were mine. The apprehensive chill that had settled in my bones during the descent into San Francisco hadn't thawed. If anything, it had crystallized. Rebecca had spent years building a fortress here, and as the gates swung shut behind me, I felt less like an owner and more like an intruder. I drove past rows of pristine Cabernet vines, their leaves shimmering with a vibrant emerald intensity under the golden hour light. This wasn't the small, charming hobby farm I had managed to picture during the flight. I saw state-of-the-art irrigation lines and high-end security cameras nestled among the Victorian eaves of the distant buildings. My wife wasn't just archiving books during those trips to California. She was archiving an empire. A man in his 60s named George Turner, the vineyard manager Rebecca had hired 4 years ago, stepped out from the vines, his weathered face breaking into a sad, knowing smile. He didn't offer a handshake immediately. Instead, he stood by the driveway studying me with a protective, almost judgmental intensity that made me want to check my own blueprints. For a fleeting dark second on the drive up, I had wondered if I'd find another man's ghost here. But George's eyes held only the reflection of a man who had lost a boss he respected. He told me right then that he'd been living on the property for 4 years and had never seen Rebecca with anyone but the soil and the books. Silence. In Napa, silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means the money is working quietly underground. It was a terrifying realization. My calm, wise Rebecca had been playing a game on a board I couldn't even see. I pulled up to the main Victorian house, the wood-wrapped porch glowing in the late afternoon sun. "You're late, mister." Garrison George said, his voice as dry as the valley dust. "She expected you in February, not November." I stepped out of the car, the smell of ripening grapes and dry earth filling my lungs. "I'm well aware of the calendar, Mr. Turner," I replied, my voice sounding hollow even to me. "I'm just trying to understand the map." George finally moved closer, his rough, calloused hand reaching out to take my suitcase, but his eyes never left mine. He explained that Rebecca had given him very specific instructions on how to handle my arrival, a timeline anchored to my 60th birthday, a milestone she apparently didn't think she would miss. Why would a woman who spent her life protecting fragile paper build something so rugged and indestructible? As we walked toward the heavy oak door of the manor house, the sense of awe was eclipsed by a mounting dread. George handed me a set of brass keys that matched the one in my pocket, but he didn't lead me toward the kitchen or the bedrooms. He gestured toward the heavy oak door leading to the cellar, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "The vines are the distraction, Thane. The truth is what's waiting for you downstairs." The descent felt like sinking into a cold, dark lake, the air turning sharp and metallic as the heavy oak door groaned against its hinges to reveal a state-of-the-art concrete vault. I followed George Turner down a flight of pristine industrial stairs, the heat of the Napa afternoon vanishing with every step. I expected the damp, earthy scent of a standard root cellar, perhaps some dusty racks and a few cobwebs. Instead, the air was precisely 55 degrees filtered and dry-smelling faintly of aged cork and the clean mineral tang of damp concrete. George paused at a secondary door, a reinforced steel hatch that looked more like the entrance to an air raid-style bunker than a wine storage room. He punched a code into a sleek keypad, and the seal broke with a hiss of pressurized air. "Rebecca called this the foundation," George said, as the lights hummed to life. "She used to say the house was just the lid on the box." As I stepped inside, the scale of the secret nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. This was no basement. It was a professional-grade wine archive powered by its own dedicated grid. Rows of floor-to-ceiling mahogany racks stretched into the soft amber glow of non-UV LED lighting. I stood there, a retired bridge inspector who prided himself on understanding how things were built, and realized I didn't know the woman I had been married to for 33 years at all. "I didn't even know she liked wine this much, George," I admitted, my voice echoing off the reinforced walls. "We usually shared a cheap Merlot on Fridays while watching the news." George didn't answer right away. his gaze lingering on the hundreds of bottles, each one a silent sentinel in the dark. The hum of the cooling system sounded like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, a rhythmic mechanical pulse that reinforced the terrifying precision Rebecca had applied to this life. How many secrets can a single basement hold before the weight of them brings the whole house down? I moved deeper into the vault, my fingers brushing against the cold glass of the bottles. George walked beside me, pointing out pre-Prohibition American vintages and rare French exports that I only recognized from luxury magazines. He stopped at a rack near the center, his hand hovering over a specific section. There are exactly 847 bottles in this room, Thane. Not one more, not one less. The number struck me like a physical blow. 847. Why does that number feel like a punch to the gut? I asked, my mind racing through dates, addresses, and bridge serial numbers. It was a record, George replied, his voice dropping an octave. Pure liquid history. Chilled to exactly 55 degrees. I touched a bottle from 1966, the year I was born, and felt a jolt of electricity. I realized the market value of just this single rack likely exceeded my entire state pension. But the number 847 wasn't about money. As George reached into a recessed shelf and pulled out a heavy leather-bound book, the math finally clicked in my mind. It was the exact number of days I had left until my 62nd birthday. The age I had always told Rebecca I would finally hang up my hard hat and retire. She had been counting down to this very moment. George pressed the textured leather-bound book into my hands, his eyes reflecting the amber glow of the vault. This isn't a ledger, Thane. It's her voice, and you need to hear what she has to say before the others arrive. The smell of Rebecca's perfume, sandalwood, and old paper clung to the heavy parchment pages as I cracked the journal open, the leather spine groaning in the silence of the vault. I stood under the flickering amber light, my hands trembling slightly as I traced the elegant loops of her handwriting. Thane, if you're reading this, then the silence has finally arrived. The first line read, "This vineyard is the physical form of the words I could never quite find. Every bottle is my gift to you, a museum of the life we built, curated for the man who spent his life making sure everyone else's bridges were safe." I felt a sharp, icy pang in my chest as the truth began to bleed through the ink. She hadn't just been hiding a property. She had been hiding her own mortality. As I turned the pages, I discovered that Rebecca had known about her terminal heart condition 3 years before the accident on Highway 101. She had deliberately chosen to withhold the diagnosis, shielding me from the clinical despair of waiting rooms so that our final years together could remain normal. While I was out inspecting rusted trusses and concrete pilings, she was frantically pouring her family inheritance into this hillside, building a legacy that would stand long after her heart stopped beating. The journal wasn't just a record of wine. It was a blueprint for a life she wanted to lead me into, a life where I was finally allowed to be soft. I had spent my career inspecting steel and concrete for invisible stress fractures. Yet I had missed the crumbling foundation of my own wife's health right in front of me. I felt a wave of anger at my own blindness, quickly followed by a crushing sense of tragic irony. She had mapped out a meticulous timeline leading up to my 60th birthday in February 2026. "By your 60th, the Heritage Hills Museum will be complete," she wrote. "You will finally lay down the blueprints and pick up a glass." There were mentions of hidden video files and detailed travel itineraries, all designed to guide me through a retirement I had always denied myself. "I was supposed to show you this in February," the ink seemed to whisper. "I was supposed to be standing right here." Have you ever felt a love so heavy it felt like a debt? Standing there, I realized Rebecca hadn't just left me a vineyard. She'd left me a responsibility to be happy, and the weight of it was staggering. The coldness of the cellar air began to seep through my clothes, making the grief feel tactile. But as I reached the end of the introductory section, the tone of her writing shifted from sentimental to survivalist. I found a hand-drawn map of the cellar with several void spaces marked in heavy charcoal. These were the crown jewels of the collection. Yet when I looked at the racks, those specific slots were empty. The final sentence of the letter was underlined in a stark, aggressive red. "The wolves will smell the vintage before you even pull the cork, Thane. Be ready." The words chilled me more than the 55-degree air ever could. I looked around the silent, fortified vault, seeing the security cameras and the reinforced steel door in a new light. This wasn't just a museum or a retirement gift. It was a target, and Rebecca had known the predators were already circling the perimeter. The sound of George's heavy boots on the concrete stairs echoed like a countdown, breaking the spectral silence of the vault and pulling me back from Rebecca's written ghost. I closed the leather-bound journal, the red underlined warning about wolves still seared into my vision. George reached the bottom step, his face illuminated by the amber LEDs of the archive. He didn't look at the bottles. He looked at me, his eyes searching for how much of the truth I had managed to digest. "We need to move, Thane," he said, but I remained rooted, my hand resting on the groaning leather of the book. "Before we go anywhere, I need to know about the road to Highway 101. I said, my voice reflecting a calm but jagged edge. George sighed, leaning against a reinforced mahogany rack. He told me that Rebecca hadn't just crashed that July afternoon. She had been at the vineyard finalizing the museum floor plans and was rushing back to Portland to be home before I finished my shift. But she wasn't just in a hurry. George revealed that she had made a frantic, unscheduled stop at a private investigator's office in San Francisco that morning. She didn't just crash Thane. She was driving like the devil himself was on her bumper, checking her mirrors at every stoplight as if she were being hunted. My stomach turned. Who would want to follow an archivist, George? It doesn't make sense. How do you reconcile the woman who kissed you goodbye with a woman who was looking over her shoulder at every stoplight? I wondered if the accident was really an accident at all, or if the stress of being pursued had finally snapped the steel of her focus. George led me out of the vault and up to the estate study, a room that smelled of old leather and fading golden light. He moved a heavy Persian rug to reveal a hidden floor safe. After a quick code, he produced a thick, weathered manila folder labeled Protection. I took it, the weight of the paper feeling heavier than the antique key in my pocket. Inside was more than just the deeds and insurance papers for a $35 million collection. It was a dossier. There were photographs, bank statements, and a detailed log of Brooke's husband, Vance Madden. A fortress isn't built to keep the world out. It's built to keep the most precious things in. The folder documented Vance's escalating gambling debts and his predatory interest in the Garrison assets. She knew the wolves were in the house, Thane George whispered, as I flipped through the evidence of my son-in-law's betrayal. She just didn't want to believe one of them was married to her daughter. My anger began to simmer, a slow heat rising from my chest to my throat. She kept this for 3 years. She was building a case while she was building a vineyard. At the very back of the folder, I found a document that made my heart stop. It was a signed, predated restraining order against Vance that Rebecca had never had the heart to file before her death. She was trying to protect Brooke, even if it meant letting the predator stay within the perimeter. George's phone let out a sharp, piercing chime, a perimeter alert from the main gate. He pulled the device from his pocket, his weathered face hardening into a mask of cold resolve. He looked at the screen and then back at me. "The wolves are earlier than I expected, Thane. I watched through the antique glass as a sleek black SUV kicked up a plume of dust against the Napa sunset, its engine purring with a predatory confidence that made my skin crawl. The cooling air of the evening had begun to settle over the vines. But inside the Victorian house, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of the protection folder I had only just tucked away. George Turner's warning about the wolves echoed in my mind as the vehicle slowed to a halt at the iron gates. I stepped out onto the porch, my boots hollow against the wood as the passenger doors swung open. My daughter Brooke Garrison Madden, a 35-year-old freelance designer, walked toward me with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of more than just grief. She looked physically drained, offering a frail hug that felt less like a greeting and more like a plea for stability in a world that was clearly spinning out of her control. "Dad, you look older than the last time I saw you," she whispered, pulling back to look at the house. "This place is massive." Before I could respond, Vance Madden Brooks' 36-year-old husband and a real estate agent who always smelled of expensive cologne and desperation scanned the vineyard with the eyes of a wolf measuring a flock. "Heritage Hills, Thane." I must say Rebecca had quite the eye for undervalued terroir. He said, his voice smooth and calculated. He didn't even mention the funeral or the 3 months of silence. He was already checking the horizon, and he casually mentioned that he'd reached out to the neighboring vineyard owners to get a sense of the local market. The fact that he'd begun his research before my wife was even in the ground turned my grief into a cold, hard knot of anger. Greed has a specific smell. It's like ozone before a storm, metallic, sharp, and cold. As I led them into the foyer, Vance didn't look at the family photos or the architectural details with any sense of warmth. He was conducting a clinical appraisal. He asked about the overhead, the water rights, and the recent tax assessments, as if he were reading a listing agreement. Brooke remained silent, her jittery hands twisting the strap of her bag. 45 acres, Thane Vance continued, his boots clicking on the polished floor. "That's a lot for a man in his sunset years to keep up with. Don't you think?" I stopped and looked him in the eye, my voice as calm as the steel beams I used to inspect. "I've spent my life making sure bridges don't collapse, Vance. I think I can handle a few rows of grapes. How do you tell your only child that her husband is a wolf without admitting you were the one who let him into the fold?" I looked at Brooke, hoping for a spark of the daughter I knew, but she just looked at the floor. "Actually, Dad," she said, her voice small, "we've been staying in a luxury hotel in San Francisco for the last 3 days. We needed some time to coordinate things." My blood turned to ice. They hadn't just arrived from Portland. They had been sitting in the city, strategizing with someone else, waiting for the right moment to strike. Vance paused at the threshold of the study, his hand lingering on the doorframe, as if he already owned the hinges. "We should talk about the future, Thane. Specifically the future you can actually afford." The silver fork in my hand felt unnervingly heavy, the rhythmic clatter against the fine china sounding less like a meal and more like the opening volleys of a war I hadn't realized I was fighting. We sat in the formal dining room, the dim atmospheric lighting casting long, jagged shadows across the table that seemed to mimic the tension between us. I had barely tasted the roast, my appetite suppressed by the cold, calculating way Vance Madden had begun to pick apart my life. He didn't even wait for the salad plates to be cleared before he shifted the conversation from polite mourning to a brutal financial audit. He spoke with the rehearsed fluency of a man who had spent his secret days in San Francisco running numbers, citing specific Napa land values and property tax laws that I hadn't even had the chance to read yet. He assumed my compliance so fully that he let it slip. He'd already contacted an estate auctioneer in the city to come out and appraise the seller. Thane, let's be realistic, Vance said, swirling a vintage Cabernet in his glass, with a casualness that bordered on insult. He clearly didn't appreciate the complexity of what he was drinking. You're a bridge inspector, not a vintner. A 45-acre property like this is a liability for a man your age. It's a weight that will eventually pull you under. Inheritance isn't a gift. For people like Vance, it's a harvest, and they don't care if they have to cut the roots to get the fruit. I looked at my daughter Brooke, but she kept her eyes fixed on her plate, her fork moving listlessly through her food. She refused to meet my gaze, her silence feeling like a heavy, suffocating blanket over the room. This property was Rebecca's heart. Vance, I replied, my voice reflecting a calm but wise anger. You're talking about it like it's a used car you're trying to flip for a commission. Vance didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his tone growing increasingly condescending, as if he were explaining a complex bridge blueprint to a child. He formally proposed that I sign over management rights to a development firm he represented, arguing that Brooke deserved her inheritance now, rather than waiting for me to inevitably decline. We can liquidate the collection and have the first 5 acres sold for development by Christmas. He suggested, the light from the chandelier glinting off his teeth. Everyone wins. The only one winning here, Vance, is the person who gets to walk away from my wife's legacy with a check. I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. Do you know the exact moment you stop seeing someone as family and start seeing them as a threat? It's usually when they start putting a price tag on your grief. I set my napkin on the table and stood up the chair, scraping against the hardwood like a scream. I watched the mask of politeness finally begin to crumble on his face, revealing the jagged, desperate edges of the predator underneath. You're not getting into that cellar, Vance. I changed the security codes this morning, and the only person on this planet who knows them besides me is George Turner. Vance set his wine glass down with a precise, chilling click, his eyes devoid of the warmth he'd been faking all evening. You think you're protecting her, Thane, but you're just being stubborn, and stubborn men usually end up alone. The cool Napa night air should have been a relief. But as I stood on the darkened porch, the distant muffled sound of a raised voice from the guest cottage made the hair on my neck stand up. Vance and Brooke had beat a hasty retreat after the dinner table confrontation, their shadows lengthening as they crossed the gravel path. I lingered in the darkness, the scent of night-blooming jasmine, thick and sweet, a cloying contrast to the bitter metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth. I moved toward the edge of the porch, my retired bridge inspector's ears tuned to the frequency of distress. Through the thin walls of the cottage, Vance's voice cut like a serrated blade. If we don't get control of this estate, Brooke, it's not just my career, it's our lives on the line, he hissed. I heard the frantic crinkle of paper and the heavy rhythmic thud of him pacing. He wasn't talking about bank loans or mortgage interest. The terminology he used, terms like vigorous and hard deadlines, suggested underground debt and high-stakes gambling syndicates. My blood ran cold as I realized the wolves weren't just at the door. They were holding the leash. Brooke's response was a jagged sobbing sound that pierced my heart. Vance, he's my father. He's grieving. I can't do this to him, she pleaded. But her protest was weak, the sound of someone already half drowned by the man she had chosen to anchor her life to. Vance didn't offer comfort. He offered an ultimatum. 7 figures, Brooke. At least 7 figures by the end of the month, or we are finished. These people don't take excuses, and they don't care about your family history. How do you protect a daughter who has already shackled herself to the man trying to sink you both? The physical ache in my chest was a dull, persistent throbbing, as I retreated into the main house. I needed the quiet of the study, the solid mahogany of my desk to ground me. I opened the protection folder George had entrusted to me, my fingers trembling as I reached past the vineyard's insurance policies. Tucked behind a stack of water rights documents, I found a small, hand-sealed envelope. Rebecca's handwriting on the front was hurried, unlike her usual graceful script. Rebecca hadn't been paranoid. She had been a target. I broke the seal, the paper crinkling in the absolute silence of the room. Thane watched the ledger she had written only weeks before her death. Vance isn't looking for a family. He's looking for a lifeline. She named him clearly a parasite who had been secretly begging her for loans to cover speculative losses he couldn't explain. The revelation hit me with the force of a structural collapse. She hadn't just suspected him. She had already cut him off financially. That act of defiance was likely what triggered his desperate move for the entire estate once she was gone. My wife had been holding the line alone, fighting a war in the shadows, while I was checking rivets and welds. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk until my knuckles turned white, the wood cold and unyielding beneath my palms. I looked out at the dark silhouette of the vines, realizing that Vance's Plan B wasn't just a suggestion. It was an ultimatum that was already in motion. The silence of the house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a countdown. The dawn light was a sickly, pale yellow through the study windows, casting long, accusing shadows across the mahogany desk as the door creaked open to reveal Brooke standing there, a silver tray of coffee in her hands and a lie already forming on her lips. The morning sun hitting the vineyard outside offered a deceptive warmth that did nothing to thaw the ice in my veins from the night before. I had spent the dark hours memorizing Rebecca's warnings, my knuckles still aching from where I had gripped the desk in the cold realization of Vance's desperation. Brooke stepped into the room, the smell of overbrewed coffee preceding her, sharp and acidic. She set the tray down with a soft rattle, and as she reached for a mug, the light caught the glint of a new, expensive diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. It was a staggering piece of jewelry, a bright bribe, or a reckless trophy bought with money Vance surely didn't have. "Dad, you've been up all night staring at that journal again," she said, her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness. "Don't you think this obsession is getting a bit unhealthy? You're misplacing your keys, and George said you seemed confused about our dinner conversation last night." I stared at her, my mind perfectly clear, realizing with a wise, growing anger that the gaslighting had officially begun. "It's not an obsession, Brooke," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "It's an archive. Your mother spent 5 years building this for us, and I have no intention of forgetting a single word she wrote. A daughter's voice is supposed to be a familiar melody, but Brooke's had become a jagged blade sharpened by a man who saw my heart as an obstacle to his bank account." She paced the room, her agitation visible in the way her fingers twisted the stem of the creamer. "Vance is right." She snapped the mask, finally slipping to reveal a sharp, defensive irritation. "This isn't grief, it's hoarding. You're clinging to ink and paper while our actual lives are falling apart. We have debts, Dad. Real-world problems that these dusty bottles won't solve. How do you fight an enemy who uses your own love as a weapon against you?" I felt a profound sense of family betrayal as she spoke. She wasn't seeing the legacy. She was seeing a liquidation opportunity. Brooke suddenly lunged for the archival journal on the desk, her fingers clawing at the leather. I was faster. I stood and physically pulled the book back, my calloused hands shielding Rebecca's handwriting from her grasp. "I am protecting what she built," I said, my chest heaving with the effort of remaining composed. "If you can't see the love in these pages, Brooke, then you're the one who is lost." She recoiled, as if I had struck her, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated resentment. She grabbed the silver tray, the metal vibrating with the force of her anger, as she turned toward the door. "Fine," she muttered, her eyes cold and distant. "Have it your way for now, but I've already invited someone who can actually help to look at the collection this afternoon. Someone who understands what's actually worth keeping." I watched her walk out the silver tray, vibrating in her hands, and I realized that the woman Rebecca warned me about wasn't just Vance's accomplice. She was becoming his masterpiece. The fortress was under siege from within. Vance was leaning against the porch railing, looking every bit the master of a domain he hadn't spent a single day building. The morning sun glinting off his gold watch with a brilliance that felt like a slap. I followed Brooke out of the study, the heavy journal still tucked under my arm like a shield. The porch was staged with an elaborate breakfast spread from a local caterer, the smell of truffled eggs and expensive coffee wafting through the air, mocking the simple, honest dust of the vineyard. Brooke took a seat next to him, her eyes bloodshot and weary. It was then that I noticed the subtle twitch in her hands and the way she glanced at the laptop sitting open on the side table. I realized with a gut-wrenching clarity that she hadn't been sleeping because Vance had been forcing her to stay up all night, using her professional design software to create fake valuations and reappraisal documents for the assets. He wasn't just gaslighting me. He was working her to the bone to manufacture the evidence of my decline. "Thane, you're nearly 60. Vance said, his voice smooth and rehearsed, as he gestured toward the miles of trellis stretching into the valley. "Why spend your final act wrestling with soil and fermentation when you could be relaxing in a managed community?" He spoke with a clinical precision, listing the tonnage of fruit and the physical demands of harvest, as if he were reading a death warrant. He weaponized my age, portraying me as an anchor dragging down Brooke's rightful inheritance. I took a slow breath, trying to channel the calm resolve I used when inspecting a bridge's foundation. 60. To a predator like Vance, 60 wasn't an age. It was an expiration date. I looked him square in the eye. "I'm not an anchor, Vance. I'm the owner, and I'm not going anywhere. I am the only one who knows the stress points of this legacy." Vance let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He reached into Brooke's bag and pulled out a handful of loose wine labels, the rare hand-archived scraps Rebecca had saved for the museum. He referred to them as overpriced bits of paper and literal trash, dropping them onto the porch floor where the morning wind began to scatter them like dead leaves. "Look at this Thane," he mocked. "You're letting a dead woman's hobby dictate your daughter's net worth. It's pathetic." "Those aren't scraps." I growled, the anger finally bubbling over. "Those are stories. Those are her life. How do you explain the value of a legacy to a man who only sees the price of the scrap metal it's built on?" He simply smiled, a cold, shark-like expression that didn't reach his eyes. He checked his gold watch and stood up. "We have an appointment at Meadowbrook later this afternoon for a tour," he mentioned casually, as if he were talking about a lunch reservation. "It's a top-tier facility, Thane. They specialize in cases like yours, people who can't let go of the past." The threat was no longer theoretical. It was an appointment on a calendar. He grabbed his car keys and signaled to Brooke, who stood up like a marionette with clipped strings. I stood alone as they drove off, the dust from their SUV settling on my boots. I knelt down to gather the discarded wine labels, clutching a crumpled 1945 Bordeaux in my palm. I realized that my age wasn't just their weapon. It was the ticking clock they intended to use to bury me alive. The crunch of George's boots on the dry earth was the only thing that kept me from following that SUV and demanding my daughter back from the man who was currently poisoning her soul. I stood on the porch, my knuckles still white from clutching that crumpled Bordeaux label, the physical evidence of Vance's disdain for everything Rebecca had built. George emerged from the edge of the vines with a look of cold, hard focus that I hadn't seen since the day I arrived. He didn't ask how the conversation went. He had clearly seen the aftermath from the rows. Thane, the security cameras didn't just catch them leaving, he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly frequency. I checked the midnight feed. Vance was siphoning high-end cases into the back of that vehicle while you were sleeping. He's already started liquidating the inventory. My rage, already simmering, flared into a protective heat that made the morning air feel like the breath of a furnace. But George wasn't finished. He explained that while he was clearing brush near the guest cottage earlier, he had overheard Vance finalizing what he called a placement agreement with Meadowbrook Facility. Vance has already drafted a petition for temporary guardianship. George whispered, his eyes scanning the horizon for the return of the black SUV. He's citing your erratic behavior and uncontrolled hoarding as grounds for immediate institutionalization. He wasn't just touring the facility, Thane. He was checking the locks on your door. The clinical coldness of the plan made my blood run cold. He thinks because I'm grieving, I'm gone. I said the words, feeling like shards of glass in my throat. He thinks age is a synonym for absence. Meadowbrook. It wasn't a nursing home. It was a cage with better landscaping. I looked out over the vast, quiet rows of the vineyard, the smell of ozone before a heat storm beginning to prickle my skin. We were outmatched by the legal maneuvers Vance was weaving, and George knew it. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the vibrating weight of the device looking like a weapon in his calloused hand. "We're calling Nathan Hughes," George insisted. "He's the only one who can move faster than a probate judge with a grudge." I watched as George placed the call, his stoic demeanor shifting into that of a soldier preparing for a siege. "Nathan, it's George. The wolves are inside the fence. We need the archive protection protocol started now." The metallic crackle of the phone speaker was the only sound in the sudden stillness of the porch. Nathan Hughes, a man Rebecca always said could outthink a snake, like Vance, answered with a corporate fury that made the speaker vibrate. In the world of high-stakes wine, a reputation is like a cork. Once it's compromised, the whole vintage turns to vinegar. Nathan's voice revealed a horrifying new reality. Vance had already attempted to sell 3 of the missing crown jewel bottles to a private collector in Tokyo. He was selling the heart of the collection before he'd even secured the deed. Nathan's voice crackled with a cold corporate fury that made the speaker vibrate. "George, tell Thane to stay in the house and lock the cellar. I'm bringing a dossier that will make Vance wish he'd stayed in Portland." I leaned against the porch railing, feeling the weight of the house behind me, realizing that the archive was no longer just a memory. It was a battlefield. A silver BMW pulled up the drive with a clinical quietness that felt far more intrusive than the SUV's roar. And I knew before the door even opened that Nathan's warning about the wolf inside the fence had arrived in a tailored suit. I stood by the study window, my hands steady, but my heart hammering a rhythmic warning against my ribs. Vance was already at the car door, his posture shifting into something obsequious and rehearsed. He ushered the driver toward the house with a proprietary wave that claimed every inch of the gravel beneath their feet. When they entered the living room, the scent of expensive leather and a sharp antiseptic cologne preceded them, cutting through the natural aroma of oak and dry earth that defined the house. Dr. Martin Shaw, a man whose smile was as sharp and sterile as a scalpel, sat opposite me with a leather portfolio that looked more like a weapon than a medical file. Vance leaned against the mantel, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. "Thane Martin here just wanted to help us clear up some of those memory lapses Brooke was worried about." Vance said, his voice dripping with a false, oily concern. I didn't look at Vance. I kept my eyes on Shaw, noticing immediately that his portfolio bore the embossed logo of the very development firm Vance had mentioned during our dinner ambush. This wasn't a doctor. He was a paid consultant for the predators. I don't have memory lapses, Vance, I replied, my voice reflecting a calm, wise anger. I have a son-in-law with an overactive imagination and a debt he can't pay. Shaw didn't flinch. He simply opened his file and began the scratching sound of a pen against paper, a noise that felt like a parasite burrowing into the silence. A psychiatric evaluation isn't a conversation. It's a dissection where the patient is still awake. He started with rapid-fire cognitive questions, asking me to recite dates and details about the vineyard's operations, hoping to catch me off balance. I answered with the precision of a bridge inspector, giving him exact figures and historical data, but his cold, appraising eyes never softened. He began asking leading questions about Rebecca's death, trying to frame my dedication to her archive as a pathological disconnection from reality. Mr. Garrison, do you find that your focus on this archive prevents you from recognizing your current financial obligations? He asked, his tone flat and clinical. My only obligation is to the truth, Doctor, I countered. Something I suspect you haven't consulted in quite a while. Brooke stood in the doorway, her face pale, her jittery hands clasping and unclasping as she watched the interrogation. Have you ever seen a man smile while he's preparing the paperwork to erase your legal existence? Shaw closed his portfolio with a definitive snap, the sound echoing in the clinical quiet of the living room. He stood up and exchanged a look of shared triumph with Vance that made my stomach turn. As they walked toward the front door, I saw Shaw pull a document from his bag and hand it to Vance. It was a pre-signed emergency recommendation for observation, a legal shortcut designed to bypass the standard court timeline and put me behind bars before Nathan could arrive. Vance didn't even look back as he closed the door. But the sound of the lock clicking felt like the first bar of a cell sliding into place. The gravel didn't just crunch under the Mercedes tires. It sounded like heavy artillery, signaling that the defensive perimeter I'd been trying to hold alone was finally getting the reinforcements Rebecca had secretly arranged years ago. I stood in the quiet foyer, the click of the front door lock still ringing in my ears like a cell door, until the powerful growl of the black S-Class broke the heavy silence of the afternoon. Nathan Hughes, a man who radiated the quiet power of old money and a CEO's ruthlessness, stepped into the library as if he were taking inventory of my very soul. He bypassed the usual pleasantries, his sharp eyes taking in the security cameras and the tension in my posture. He didn't wait for me to speak. Thane, your wife, knew her books, but she knew people even better, he said, the faint smell of expensive cigar smoke clinging to his wool coat. She saw Vance coming from 3 states away. She contacted me months before her death to ensure the Garrison archive would be protected from domestic threats. I felt a surge of relief mixed with a fresh wave of grief at Rebecca's foresight. I thought I was the one protecting her, Nathan. I admitted, my voice reflecting a calm, wise anger. I didn't know she was the one building the walls. Nathan set a physical dossier on the mahogany table and opened an encrypted laptop, the hum of the machine, a steady clinical pulse in the room. He revealed that Rebecca had left a poison pill in the corporate structure of the estate, a legal clause that makes the vineyard practically worthless if sold without my express, competent consent. It was a fail-safe, a trap for the greedy. Debt isn't just numbers on a screen. For a man like Vance, it's an addiction that eats everyone at the table. Nathan's fingers danced across the keyboard, bringing up the bright, clinical glare of gambling spreadsheets. He laid out Vance Madden's true financial profile, a staggering $183,000 in high-interest gambling debts across offshore platforms and local private lenders. More shockingly, he showed me evidence that Vance began researching the market value of Heritage Hills and local conservatorship laws nearly 2 years ago. $183,000, Nathan set his voice flat. He's not just in debt, Thane. He's drowning, and he's using your daughter as his oxygen tank. My blood turned to ice as the depth of the betrayal settled in. He didn't just target the land, I whispered. He targeted Brooke. How do you fight a man who has already spent the money he plans to steal from your dead wife? Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he presented a copy of an email Vance sent to a debt collector 3 days ago, promising full payment upon the successful transition of the patriarch to a permanent care facility. The clinical coldness of the sentence was a physical blow. He wasn't just waiting for me to decline. He was counting on it. Nathan slid a final photograph across the desk, the stone floor of the library feeling cold beneath my boots. It showed Vance meeting with Dr. Shaw at a casino in Reno 6 months ago, their heads bent together in a dark corner. This wasn't an evaluation, Thane Nathan said, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the laptop. This was a business transaction. The night air was deathly still, but the voices bleeding through the cottage walls were jagged and sharp, carrying the unmistakable sound of a man backing his wife into an emotional corner she couldn't escape. I stood in the heavy shadows of the main house eaves, my breath held, as I listened to the low, urgent murmur of voices coming from the guest cottage as night settled over the vines. Nathan's dossier was still a cold weight in my mind, but the reality was playing out in real time just 50 yards away. I saw Vance Madden standing in the doorway of the cottage, already dressed in a sharp suit, despite the hour drinking a glass of the vineyard's premier Cabernet. He looked less like a grieving relative and more like a conqueror surveying a fallen city. "I can't go to jail for our lifestyle, Brooke." His voice drifted out cold and devoid of anything resembling love. "Sign the damn papers, or you're on your own when the sharks come knocking." There was a pause, then the sound of my daughter's broken weeping, a jagged noise that tore through the bitter smell of the morning fog. "He's my father, Vance," she sobbed. "God help me, I'm signing his life away." I closed my eyes, the cold weight of the brass door handle against my palm feeling like a useless anchor. A signature. That's all it takes to turn a daughter into an executioner. I watched her silhouette move against the cottage curtains, the sound of a pen scratching a signature onto a document I knew would be my legal death warrant. I wanted to scream, to run out and pull her away from him, but my feet were leaden. The betrayal wasn't a sudden crack. It was the slow, steady hum of a bridge failing under a load it was never designed to carry. Have you ever felt the law wrap around your throat like a silk tie, tightening every time you try to speak the truth? By 6 a.m., the peaceful Napa morning was shattered by the blue-red flash of light reflecting off the vineyard leaves. A sheriff, with a face like weathered granite and a badge that caught the first rays of the sun, stepped onto my porch, holding an envelope that felt heavier than a lead pipe. "Thane Garrison, you've been served?" He said, his voice as flat as the asphalt. "I suggest you call your lawyer immediately." I took the legal parchment, the crinkle of it sounding like a death knell in the dawn silence. It was a petition for an emergency temporary conservatorship citing Dr. Shaw's fabricated findings and Brooke's newly signed affidavit as proof of my mental incompetence. The hearing was set for November 10th. As I scanned the fine print, the final twist of the knife revealed itself. The summons included an immediate freeze on all estate assets, Vance had ensured I couldn't even use the vineyard's funds to pay for the high-priced legal defense I now desperately needed. I looked up from the legal parchment to see Brooke watching from the cottage window, her face a mask of shame. But it was the sight of Vance raising his wine glass in a silent toast that told me the siege had officially begun. The paper in my hand felt like a live wire, the legal jargon humming with a destructive energy that threatened to ground my life before I'd even finished Rebecca's first bottle. I stood on the porch, my fingers trembling, as I frantically dialed Gregory Wilson's number. The sheriff's cruiser pulled away its taillights, bleeding into the thick Napa morning fog, leaving me standing in the wreckage of a calculated betrayal. Gregory picked up on the third ring, his voice already sharpening into a professional blade. I retreated to the library where Nathan and Gregory were already pulling up legal precedents on a laptop, the hum of the cooling fan sounding like a death rattle in the quiet room. Gregory explained that the temporary conservatorship served to me was a blunt instrument designed for medical emergencies, and Vance had weaponized it by freezing my access to every liquid asset in the vineyard's name. He pointed to a specific paragraph in the summons. This limited power of attorney Brooke signed actually includes a mutual consent clause. Gregory said, his face shadowed in the blue-gray light of the rainy morning. It means she has unknowingly given Vance the power to overrule her own decisions regarding your care. If she tries to change her mind, he can legally block her. The realization was a physical weight. Vance was trying to starve us out, ensuring I couldn't afford a high-tier defense and would be forced to rely on state-appointed counsel who wouldn't have the time to look for the cracks in his story. Thane, they aren't just questioning your memory. They're trying to evict you from your own mind. Nathan said, his eyes fixed on the dossier. How do you prove you're sane to a world that views grief as a mental illness and inheritance as a trophy for the fastest predator? I looked at the stacks of legal documents, the smell of stale coffee and ink filling my lungs. I've spent my life measuring cracks in steel, I replied, my voice reflecting a calm, wise anger. I know when a foundation is being sabotaged. Gregory warned that the hearing on November 10th would center entirely on Dr. Shaw's report. They would portray my focus on the wine cellar as a senile fixation, a symptom of a mind that had lost its grip on reality. Nathan admitted he had hired an independent evaluator, but there wasn't enough time to get a new report before the judge ruled on the temporary order. A bridge doesn't collapse from the weight on top. It collapses when the supports underneath are eaten away by rust. Our only hope was to attack Vance's credibility and the debt motive immediately, but we were walking into a room where the deck was already stacked. As we concluded the strategy session, Nathan leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. He admitted something that made my heart stop. He had been paying George Turner a separate security retainer for 3 years to specifically monitor Vance. Rebecca had known her son-in-law would strike and set the trap long ago, even if she couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger while she was alive. I wasn't just following a map. I was following a battle plan. Gregory closed his briefcase with a final echoing snap that made the shadows in the library jump. Prepare yourself, Thane. On Monday, your daughter will have to choose between her husband's debts and her father's freedom. The limestone steps of the Napa County Courthouse were slick with a freezing November rain that seemed determined to wash away the last of my dignity before I even reached the courtroom doors. I gripped the railing with a hand that felt ancient, my knuckles pale against the wet stone. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was a suffocating mix of wet wool and floor wax, thick enough to choke the breath out of a man who had spent his life in the open air of bridge spans. I took my seat at the defendant's table, the wood of the chair hard and cold against my spine. Across the aisle, Vance Madden sat with a look of predatory satisfaction a thick manila folder resting on his lap. Every few moments he would tap the cover of that folder with a rhythmic, threatening cadence whenever Brooke looked his way. It was a silent leash, a physical reminder of the financial ruin he had shackled her with to ensure her compliance today. Judge Brennan, a man with white hair that looked like spun glass, and a temperament that seemed as rigid as the oak bench he sat upon, looked down at me through gold-rimmed bifocals. He motioned for the proceedings to begin, and the room became a theater of character assassination. Dr. Martin Shaw took the stand with the practiced ease of a mercenary. He systematically dismantled my life, testifying that my fixation on the 847 wine bottles was a clear indicator of cognitive decline and a hoarding disorder. He spoke of my emotional instability and fabricated lapses in reasoning with a clinical tone that transformed his paid-for opinion into gospel truth. Your Honor, Mr. Garrison exhibits a classic pathological attachment to inanimate objects, prioritizing an archival fantasy over his own daughter's welfare, Shaw stated. I felt a surge of helpless fury. That's not clinical data. That's a character assassination paid for in Reno, Gregory shouted, but the rhythmic thud of the court reporter's typing continued unabated as the judge's gavel silenced him. Lies don't need to be loud to be lethal. They just need to be delivered by a man with a medical degree. I looked toward the windows, hearing the freezing rain hitting the glass like gravel, feeling more isolated than I ever had on a bridge 100 feet above the water. Gregory stood and called Brooke to the stand, a final desperate attempt to find a character witness in the wreckage. The room went still as she approached, her eyes red-rimmed and darting toward Vance before settling on the floor. Brooke, look at me. Gregory urged, his voice soft but firm. Tell the judge the truth about your mother's vineyard. Is your father capable? She hesitated for an agonizing 30 seconds, the silence stretching until it felt like it would snap. How do you defend yourself against a daughter's silence when it carries the weight of a guilty verdict? I think Dad needs help. She finally whispered, her shaky voice barely audible over the rain. I think Vance is just trying to do what's best for the family. It was the final snap of the cable. Judge Brennan leaned back, adjusting his bifocals. He revealed he had already received a private brief from Dr. Shaw prior to this morning, meaning the judicial foundation had been poisoned long before we entered the room. The judge leaned forward, his gavel hovering like an executioner's axe, and I realized that my own daughter's refusal to speak was the final nail in the coffin of my freedom. The gavel didn't just strike the wood. It sounded like the lid of a casket being hammered shut, echoing through the cavernous courtroom and drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. I sat paralyzed as Judge Brennan delivered the final verdict from the bench, his voice possessing a cold, surgical precision that made the legal terms feel like physical wounds. Based on the evidence provided by Dr. Shaw, I find Mr. Garrison to be a danger to his own estate. The judge announced, his eyes fixed on the documents rather than my face. Remand to Meadowbrook is effective immediately. I felt the air leave my lungs. Your Honor, this is a kidnapping with a court order. Gregory Wilson shouted, his face as red as the mahogany walls, but his protest was a single leaf against a hurricane. The judgment was final. I watched in a state of suspended horror as Vance Madden maintained a somber, respectful facade for the judge, while Brooke hid her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling violently with a grief she had helped manufacture. Before I could even stand to speak to my daughter, 2 bailiffs moved in with a speed that suggested I was a high-risk fugitive. I discovered then that a last-minute addendum to Dr. Shaw's report had classified me as potentially violent, giving the court excuse to treat me like a common criminal. "Keep your hands where I can see them, mister." Garrison, one of the men, barked, his hand resting on his holster. "It's for your own safety." The humiliation was a cold, thick slime coating my skin. I wasn't even allowed to return to Heritage Hills to pack a bag or say goodbye to the vines. 30 days. In the world of rare wine, 30 days is enough to ruin a vintage. In the world of predators, it's enough to erase a man. They led me out of a side exit, away from the eyes of the gallery and the rain-slicked steps of the courthouse. I was loaded into the back of a white transport van, marked with the Meadowbrook logo, the metal interior cold and smelling of industrial exhaust fumes. The courthouse was a machine of justice, but today it had been fed a diet of lies and turned into a wood chipper for my soul. As the bailiff slammed the rear doors, I pressed my face against the small, barred window, the vibration of the engine rattling my teeth. I saw Vance standing in the courthouse parking lot, the rain drenching his tailored suit as he finally dropped the act. He didn't look like a grieving son-in-law anymore. He wore a look of absolute triumphant conquest. "You won't keep me there, Vance." I whispered against the cold glass, a simmering, reflective resolve beginning to harden the remains of my spirit. The foundation of this lie is already cracking, but as the van pulled away, I saw him reach into his pocket and hand a set of keys, the specific brass keys to the Heritage Hills cellar, to Dr. Martin Shaw. It was the physical payment for a medical lie. The van lurched forward, and as the iron gates of Heritage Hills blurred into a gray smear against the driving rain, I realized I wasn't just losing my home, I was becoming a ghost in my own life. The smell of industrial lemon cleaner and the high-pitched hum of magnetic locks were the first things to greet me at Meadowbrook, a place that looked like a 5-star resort, but felt like a tomb with a landscape budget. As the transport van's doors opened, the oppressive rain of Napa Valley was replaced by a sterile, climate-controlled vacuum. I was led through the intake area, my feet heavy on the linoleum. The staff moved with a terrifying rhythmic efficiency, stripping me of my identity piece by piece. My leather belt, my car keys, and the sturdy field watch I had worn to every bridge inspection for 20 years were confiscated. "I'm afraid your watch has to stay in the locker, mister." Garrison, the intake clerk, said, her voice possessing a flat, rehearsed cheerfulness. "We wouldn't want you losing track of time, would we?" I looked her in the eye, my voice reflecting a calm, wise anger. "I don't need a watch to know exactly how long a lie can survive in a place like this." I was assigned to room 204, a space that felt designed to erode the senses with its muted beige walls and the antiseptic white glow of the hall lights. My roommate was an older man who seemed entirely incoherent, his shuffling feet creating a constant, restless sandpaper sound against the floor. I watched him for an hour, my bridge inspector's eye, tracing the structural weaknesses of the room, until I realized the man was mumbling legal citations. I leaned in, listening to the fragments of probate code, and realized with a jolt of horror that he was a former attorney who had been disappeared into this facility through a scheme identical to the one Vance was running on me. A facility like this doesn't heal you. It just manages your disappearance. It is a warehouse for the inconvenient. I lay on the bed, the cold, tactile feel of the thin, hospital-grade sheets reminding me that I was now a ward of the state. How do you maintain your sanity when the walls are designed to convince you that your memory is a traitor by the first evening rounds? I was already cataloging the guard shifts and the fire exit weight sensors. That was when I met Nurse Carol, a woman with tired eyes and a professional kindness that didn't feel manufactured, who moved through the room with the practiced grace of a woman who had seen too many good men forgotten. She checked my vitals, but unlike the others, she didn't use the patronizing, simplified speech reserved for the broken. "You're checking the door hinges, mister." "Garrison," she said softly, noting where my eyes had drifted. "Most residents here are lucky if they remember where the door leads." I looked at her, finding a flicker of recognition in her gaze. "Force of habit," I replied. "Bridges, buildings, institutions. They all have cracks if you look close enough." I told her about my life as an inspector, and for a brief moment, the walls of Meadowbrook seemed to recede. But the shadows returned quickly. Carol leaned in to adjust my pillow, her voice a ghost of a whisper against my ear. She quietly revealed that, "Doctor, Shaw is a preferred provider here, meaning the facility is paid to validate his specific findings. Mr. Garrison, I've seen real decline, and you're as sharp as a razor. You shouldn't be here, and we both know why." The scratch of a visitor's badge being clipped to a coat in the sterile reception area echoed through the hallway, signaling that my isolation was being breached by something other than a nurse with a sedative. I sat in the visiting room of Meadowbrook, my hands resting on the cold, tactile feel of the partition glass, still reeling from the secret nurse Carol had whispered in my ear. I was trapped in a rigged game, but I wasn't alone. The man sitting across from me in the visitor's booth didn't look like a savior. He looked like a weary insurance adjuster with a cheap tie and a coffee stain on his collar. But the folder he slid toward me contained enough high-explosive evidence to level Vance's house of cards. Jake Morrison, a man with the weary eyes of a bloodhound, and a cheap suit that smelled faintly of menthol and old car upholstery, sat across from me like a man who had seen every way a person could be lied to. He was posing as a legal assistant from Gregory's office, but the way he scanned the room for cameras told me his expertise was far more practical. He leaned in his voice, competing with the muted buzz of the facility intercom and the rhythmic hum of a vending machine in the corner. "Vance isn't just desperate, Mr. Garrison," he whispered. "He's on a clock. His debts aren't to a bank. They're to a collection syndicate that doesn't use lawyers. They've set a hard deadline of November 30th. If he doesn't produce a liquid asset, by then he's finished." Jake revealed that the diamond bracelet I'd seen on Brooks' wrist was bought with a loan secured against the future sale of Heritage Hills, signed with a forged version of my own signature. Evidence is a funny thing. It doesn't change what happened, but it changes who holds the knife. I felt a surge of calculating hope as I sifted through the surveillance photos Jake had brought. One showed Vance meeting with a high-end liquor auctioneer in San Francisco, just 48 hours after the funeral. The report proved Vance had drained $45,000 from Brooks' personal business savings to grease the wheels for the probate freeze. "He didn't just take it," Jake said, watching me through the glass. "He gambled it on the hope that you'd be too broken to fight back." My grief transitioned into a cold, protective fury. He had stolen my daughter's future to pay for his past sins. Vance thought he was playing chess with an old man, but he didn't realize I'd been inspecting the stability of far larger structures than his fragile ego for 40 years. I knew how to find the hairline fracture that would bring the whole span down. The November 30th deadline wasn't just for the debt. It was the date the developer's option to buy the vineyard expires. If he doesn't break me in the next 2 weeks, the deal evaporates and he loses everything. Jake stood up, tapping the glass partition one last time, the sharp crinkle of the photos being tucked away, sounding like a final warning. "One more thing, Thane. We found out who Brooks' guest is for tomorrow. It's not another doctor. It's a liquidator." I watched him leave my mind, already building the counteroffensive. I wasn't just a prisoner anymore. I was a man with a target. The rhythmic clicking of heels on the linoleum floor wasn't the sound of a nurse or a liquidator. It was the precise, measured stride of a woman who carried authority like a shield and sharp intelligence like a blade. I sat in the evaluation room, my back straight, refusing to look like the broken man Vance wanted the world to see. Brooke entered first, her eyes downcast, followed by a woman who commanded the sterile space the moment she stepped through the door. Doctor. Patricia Reynolds, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to possess the depth of an aged, tawny port, looked at me as if she were reading the blueprints of my mind. Vance had told Brooke that this was a liquidator coming to value the dead weight of the cellar, a final step before the probate judge closed the book on my autonomy. But as she sat down and opened a high-end notebook, I saw a flicker of something in her gaze that didn't belong to a bean counter. I decided to test the structural integrity of this new visitor. "I'm here to see the liquid assets, Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice a rich, calm contralto. "Specifically, the 1921 pre-prohibition stock." I leaned forward, the antiseptic white of the evaluation room making her dark blazer stand out. "The 1921 isn't for sale," I replied, my voice steady. "It hasn't finished its story yet." She didn't flinch. In fact, she smiled, a genuine knowing expression. "Only a true curator knows that the 1921 hasn't reached its peak because of the high acidity levels during that particular harvest," she countered. The air in the room shifted. This was no liquidator. She was an expert witness operating under deep cover sent by Nathan to get a court-admissible evaluation right under Vance's nose. "Before I reveal the detail that changes everything about this meeting, are you still holding on to this story? Comment A if you think she's an ally, or B if she's a double agent, and add one short reason. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to convey the core message. In this room, the vintage wasn't the wine. It was the truth." Doctor. Reynolds conducted a high-level cognitive test, disguised as a technical discussion about Napa terroir and the chemistry of aging. She probed my memory of the vineyard's foundation and the archive's layout. "How do you explain the difference between a hoarder and a curator to a man who only understands the value of $1 and the thrill of a bet?" She was visibly stunned by my total recall. "Thane Drive. Shaw's report claims you are fixated." She whispered the low hum of a recording device in her pocket, catching every word. "I see a man who is the only person sane enough to realize what he's protecting. I've spent my life making sure things don't fall apart," I told her. "I'm not about to let my wife's life's work be the first thing that does." As she prepared to leave, the professional mask returned, but she leaned in close enough for me to catch the scent of aged port. She revealed she had been a student of Rebecca's 30 years ago and was taking this case as a personal debt to her mentor. She closed her notebook with a sharp, final slap and looked me dead in the eye. "Mr. Garrison, I'm going to make sure that by this time next week, Vance Madden is the one looking for a place to hide." The courtyard of Meadowbrook was a masterpiece of manicured deception, where the fountain's rhythmic splashing tried and failed to drown out the heavy, tactical silence Nathan Hughes brought with him into the shadows. I met him in a far corner, away from the watchful eyes of the orderlies, the cold evening mist clinging to the wool of my institution-issued sweater. Nathan didn't waste time on comfort. He leaned, in his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the water. "I intercepted Brooke at a coffee shop near her studio," he whispered. "I bypassed Vance's surveillance and delivered the protection folder directly into her hands." I felt my lungs tighten, the breath hitching in my throat, as I imagined my daughter looking at the evidence of her husband's decay. Nathan told me she didn't scream or call the police. She just looked at the photo of Vance and Shaw meeting in Reno and went as pale as the paper in her hand. She asked one question before she walked out: "Did my mother know about the Reno trip?" The implication hit me like a physical blow. She was already connecting the dots, realizing that Rebecca might have been hunted by the man she welcomed into our home. Truth is like a vintage Cabernet. Once the bottle is uncorked, you can't stop the air from changing the flavor. Nathan warned me that the bridge between me and my daughter was now carrying a load that would either reinforce it or cause a total collapse. Vance likely knows the folder has been delivered by now. Nathan set his eyes scanning the shadowed perimeter. He'll be amping up the gaslighting or the threats to keep her from reading the rest. We have to hope she's strong enough to accept that the man she loves is a predator. How do you sleep when you know the only person who can save you is currently deciding whether to burn the evidence of your betrayal? I stared at the fountain, the splashing sound suddenly feeling like the ticking of a clock. If she chooses him after seeing that evidence, Nathan, then I've truly lost her. I said, my voice reflecting a profound, reflective vulnerability. I've lost everything Rebecca tried to save. Nathan placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. She's a Garrison Thane. She might be slow to see the cracks, but she knows how to read the integrity of a structure once the light hits it. We finalized the coordination for the second hearing, acknowledging that Brooke was now the wild card. But a cold thought settled in my gut as I processed Nathan's strategy. By giving her that folder, Nathan had intentionally made my daughter a target for Vance's desperation as the November 30th deadline approached. He was using her as bait to force Vance into a mistake. I watched Nathan disappear into the evening mist, his silhouette swallowed by the gray dampness. I was led back to my room, the heavy magnetic lock of the courtyard door clicking shut, with a sound that felt like a finality I wasn't ready to face. I lay on the thin sheets, staring at the pale glow of the moon through the barred window. My life wasn't in the hands of a judge or a doctor anymore. It was sitting on my daughter's nightstand, a collection of paper and ink that would either set me free or bury me forever. The smuggled cell phone vibrated against my ribs like a frantic heartbeat, its small screen illuminating the sterile white walls of my room with a message that promised to either burn the bridge between me and Brooke or finally reinforce it. I reached for the device with trembling fingers. The cold, tactile feel of the bed frame ground me in the reality of my confinement. It was 2 a.m., and the smell of industrial floor wax hung heavy in the recirculated air. George Turner's gravelly whisper came through the speaker, breathless and low. "Thane, she didn't just read the folder," he said. "She broke." I've never seen a woman's soul catch fire like that. He explained that Brooke had returned to Heritage Hills alone, while Vance was in San Francisco celebrating with his creditors. She didn't stay in the guest house. She went straight for the wine cellar. George revealed that she had actually caught Vance on the house's internal intercom earlier that day, overhearing him bragging to a liquidator about how easy it was to break her spirit. That was the hairline fracture that brought her loyalty down. "Did she see the forged signature, George the Fur?" asked my voice, a jagged rasp in the dark. "Did she see what he did to her mother?" George confirmed she had spent 4 hours cross-referencing Rebecca's archival journal with the PY's hard facts. A Garrison woman is like the vintage we protect sweet on the surface, but possessing a tannin structure that can endure a century of pressure. George described a seismic shift in her. He watched through the monitors as she had a screaming match with the empty air, her protective fury finally erupting after months of manipulation. She clutched her mother's 1990 Margot like a talisman, a piece of glass, and fermented grapes becoming the anchor for her sanity. He told me she discovered a passage I hadn't even reached, a hidden entry, where Rebecca confessed her fear that Vance was poisoning Brooke's perception of love. The cellar wasn't just a vault anymore. It was an operating room, where Brooke finally cut out the cancer of her husband's influence. She emerged from that basement with her eyes hardened, possessing the same structural integrity I had taught her to respect in steel since she was a child. She asked for the keys to the master bedroom safe, Thane George reported. She's not running away anymore. My heart hammered against my chest, a mix of triumphant relief and tactical focus. She's coming for him, isn't she? I whispered. No, Mr. Garrison, George replied, and I could almost hear his grim smile. She's coming for you. He revealed that Brooke has already contacted Nathan Hughes to surrender all of Vance's private files she recovered from their shared office. She is turning state's evidence before Vance even realizes the ground has vanished beneath his feet. I felt a cold, tactical hope replace the hollow despair that had been my only companion in this room. The awakening in the foundation was complete. I closed the phone and stared at the moonlight on the floor, knowing that while I was still locked in this room, the wolves were no longer the only ones hunting in the dark. My daughter was no longer a victim being managed. She had become the architect of our escape, and she was already rewriting the blueprints for the coming storm. I lay back against the thin pillow, finally feeling the strength of the bloodline I thought I had lost. The heavy footsteps of a security guard outside the door forced me to shove the smuggled phone under my thin mattress, maintaining the mask of a broken man staring blankly at the sterile white wall. I waited until the rhythmic jingle of his keys faded down the hallway, the smell of industrial floor wax lingering in the air like a chemical threat. My mind was a construction site of tactical hope. By morning, I was led once more into the bright, cold light of the visiting room. Nathan Hughes didn't slide a file across the table this time. He simply leaned in, his eyes bright with the kind of hard-won satisfaction that only comes when a long-shot bridge finally holds its weight under a storm. He spoke in a steady, reassuring voice that cut through the low hum of the facility. She left him Thane, he said. Brooke has officially moved out of the guest cottage and into a secured hotel room. She's already rescinded that power of attorney. Nathan told me about their final confrontation, how Vance tried to use his gambling debts as a weapon against her, only for my daughter to reveal she had already turned his financial logs over to the authorities. But there was a darker detail. Brooke found a recording on Vance's phone where he was laughing about Rebecca's timely accident, implying he might have played a role in the distraction that led to the crash. My hands curled into fists against the plastic table. I felt a surge of pride that nearly eclipsed the rage. And the hearing, I asked. She's demanding to be the lead witness for the defense, Nathan replied. Forgiveness is a heavy vintage. It takes time to breathe, but once it does, it can wash away years of bitterness. I had spent so long worrying she was a liability, but in the silence of that visiting room, I realized she had become my greatest ally. Nathan reached into his pocket and handed me a small handwritten note. The paper felt scratchy and real against my skin, a stark contrast to the clinical hollowness of Meadowbrook. Tell Dad I'm sorry for being blind, it read. Tell him the Garrison archive isn't going anywhere. I'll fix this. Nathan explained that she'd spent 48 hours with Dr. Reynolds, providing a timeline that proved my supposed cognitive decline was nothing more than environmental stress orchestrated by Vance's abuse. She's become a formidable woman, Thane Nathan said. She reminds me more of Rebecca every hour. Have you ever felt the exact moment a person you love stops being a liability and starts being your greatest ally? I read the note again, my eyes stinging. She wasn't just coming to save me. She was coming to restore the foundation Vance had tried to rot. She's already filed for divorce and secured an emergency injunction to keep that predator at least 500 yards away from Heritage Hills. The sound of a heavy door locking somewhere in the facility signaled the end of our session, but for the first time, The noise didn't sound like a cage closing. It sounded like a starting pistol. I clutched Brooke's note in my hand as the guard led me back to my room, and for the first time since the gavel fell, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a man preparing for a counter-offensive. I spent the evening smoothing out my suit, the fabric of familiar comfort, as I prepared to face the world again. The crisp feel of a fresh white shirt against my skin was a small but vital armor as I dressed for the most important day of my life. The courthouse steps didn't feel slick with rain this time. They felt like the base of a bridge I had spent my entire life learning how to anchor against the tide. I climbed them with a steady gait, flanked by Gregory Wilson and Nathan Hughes, the smell of wet pavement and expensive wool following us into the sterile, fluorescent heat of the building. I walked into courtroom 4B with a sharp suit and a sharper focus. The room was already buzzing, but the noise reached a fever pitch when Brooke entered. I saw Vance Madden beckoning to her from the front row, his hand outstretched with a proprietary arrogance that made my stomach turn. "Brooke, what the hell are you doing? The family table is over here." Vance hissed, his voice carrying through the sudden hush. My daughter didn't even break her stride. She ignored his hand and walked straight to the defense table, pulling out the chair beside me. "I am sitting with my family, Vance," she said, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You're just the man who used to be invited." I felt an electric jolt of vindication as Vance's expression shifted from smug confidence to a mask of twitching, pale-faced horror. He realized his primary witness had defected, and I noticed Nathan glancing toward the gallery. He didn't just bring files. He had brought two men in dark, conservative suits, federal investigators from the Gaming Commission, who sat with their eyes locked on Vance like hawks. The courtroom isn't a theater, but today the audience knew the lead actor had just switched scripts. The air felt heavy, charged with the scent of floor wax and the low hum of shifting bodies. Gregory Wilson stood the cold, tactile feel of the mahogany defense table beneath his palms as he officially petitioned the court to admit new evidence and a revised witness list. He was no longer the polite counselor from the first hearing. "Your Honor, we aren't here to discuss a man's memory," he announced, his voice a calm but wise boom. "We are here to discuss a predator's paper trail. We will prove this conservatorship was obtained through a premeditated scheme of elder abuse and financial fraud." Vance's attorney lunged to his feet to object, his voice thin and desperate. But Judge Brennan didn't even look at him. The judge was watching Brooke. "Sit down, mister." Madden, the judge, barked, his gold-rimmed bifocals glinting under the lights. "I will hear from the daughter before this gavel strikes again." A trial is like a stress test on a suspension cable. One weak link, and the whole structure of a lie comes crashing into the water. I could hear Vance's heavy breathing in the silence that followed. The judge then revealed he had received an anonymous summary of Vance's private debts that morning, a document that had clearly poisoned the petitioner's standing. I wondered if David had finally found his courage, or if George had moved a few more pieces in the dark. The sharp crack of the gavel sounded like a starting pistol. Gregory turned toward the gallery and called our first witness, and as Dr. Patricia Reynolds stood up, the look of recognition on Vance's face told me he finally realized the liquidator he'd hired was actually his executioner. I watched her approach the stand, the click of her heels the only sound in the room. The steady professional stride of Dr. Reynolds as she approached the witness stand felt like the arrival of a tide that was finally turning in my favor. She didn't just walk to the stand. She occupied it, her presence as unfiltered and potent as a cask-strength brandy in a room full of watered-down lies. I watched from the defense table, my back straight, feeling the cold, tactile feel of the wooden pews behind me, and the heavy silence of the shocked gallery. Doctor. Reynolds began by systematically dismantling the foundation of Dr. Shaw's earlier testimony. She revealed that Shaw had been under a secret board investigation for 3 months for exactly this type of predatory diagnosis for hire, a revelation that sent a visible tremor through Vance as he sat across the aisle. Thane Garrison doesn't just remember dates, Your Honor. He remembers the structural integrity of every bridge he ever inspected and every bottle he now protects. She stated, her voice echoing off the old wood. She presented the results of the wine-themed cognitive tests we had conducted at Meadowbrook, proving my memory capacity sat in the 99th percentile for my age group. Doctor, Shaw's report isn't medical science. It's a creative writing exercise funded by a gambling debt. Academic vindication tasted sweeter than any vintage I had ever uncorked. I glanced at Brooke, whose eyes were fixed on the witness, her expression a mix of dawning hope and lingering shame. A search bar is a window into a man's soul, and Vance's soul was a cluttered basement of debt and desperation. Jake Morrison took the stand. Next, the scent of old wood and digital heat rising as he prepared the projector. The blue glow of the screen hit Vance's face, highlighting the sweat on his brow, as his search history was projected for the entire court to see. It was a digital execution. We saw the searches for elder guardianship loopholes and the Meadowbrook intake process, but it was the specific valuation of a 1945 Romane Conti that made the room go cold. Mr. Madden wasn't looking for a doctor for his father-in-law. He was looking for an ATM with a pulse. Jake said the rhythmic tapping of the court reporter the only other sound. The courtroom was no longer a place of debate. It had become a crime scene where the blood on the floor was made of data and broken trust. The data doesn't lie, Vance. You were spending the inheritance before the funeral was even scheduled. To seal the casket, Jake presented a deleted email showing Vance had already signed a pre-sale agreement for the missing crown jewel bottles to an anonymous buyer in Macau. Vance looked like a man who had finally run out of bridge to cross. As the final slide faded from the screen, Judge Brennan looked at Vance with a coldness that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. Mr. Madden, I think it's time we hear from your wife. The sound of Brooke's heels against the courtroom floor was the slow, steady rhythm of a woman reclaiming her voice from a man who had spent years trying to drown it in debt and doubt. I watched her walk toward the stand, my chest tight with a mixture of agony and hope. When she finally sat and turned toward me, her eyes were filled with tears, but for the first time in months, they weren't clouded by Vance's shadows. I didn't doubt my father's mind. Your Honor, she began, her voice gaining strength as she looked directly at Judge Brennan. I was taught to doubt my own heart by the man I married. She spoke of the systematic gaslighting Vance had employed, the staged incidents where he'd hidden my keys or claimed I'd forgotten conversations that never happened. She revealed she had already filed for an emergency annulment based on this elaborate fraud stripping Vance of any marital claim to the estate. Then she produced a small recording device. The room went deathly silent as Vance's recorded voice filled the space, threatening her to sign the power of attorney or face the consequences of his debts alone. My mother's vineyard wasn't a burden to him, she said, her voice cracking but holding firm. It was a museum of a love he couldn't understand and a bank account he couldn't wait to empty. Have you ever watched a lie collapse? It doesn't fall all at once. It splinters, the sound of wood groaning under a weight it was never meant to carry. I watched Vance in the front row, his face transforming from a mask of defiance into a gray, twitching ruin as he realized the foundation of his scheme had turned to dust. Before I reveal the moment the gavel finally fell to restore my life, are you still with me? Comment justice if you felt that turn, and tell me one thing you think Vance deserves most. Please note the next part contains some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. The purpose is reflection and learning. If you're still here watching this story reach its turning point, listen closely. Judge Brennan signaled for the bailiffs to step closer. He asked for a final reading from Rebecca's journal, a passage where she described her absolute trust in my unshakable foundation. Free. The word tasted better than the finest vintage in the cellar. The judge scathingly rebuked Dr. Shaw and Vance, his voice like the strike of a hammer on steel. This court was used as a weapon in a war of greed. He declared the bright, cold glare of the afternoon sun through the windows, highlighting the finality in his expression. Mr. Garrison, you are free to return to your home and your legacy. He immediately rescinded the temporary conservatorship and restored my full legal rights. The echoing crack of the gavel sounded like the closing of a chapter of darkness. Bailiffs, please escort Mr. Madden from this room, Brennan ordered. He is to have no contact with the Garrison family until further notice. As Vance was led out, looking small and broken between the officers, the judge added one final blow, freezing all of Vance's personal bank accounts to ensure the return of the stolen Margot funds. I felt the warmth of Brooke's hand as she stepped down from the stand and gripped mine, the scent of old parchment and floor wax grounding us in the reality of our victory. I stood up as a free man, but my eyes weren't on the judge. They were on the empty seat where Vance had sat, and the realization that a cornered wolf is most dangerous when the pack has left him behind. The courtroom doors swung open with a heavy thud, and for the first time in weeks, the air didn't taste like the sterile confinement of Meadowbrook. It tasted like ozone and the coming rain of a Napa winter. Brooke walked beside me, her hand resting firmly in the crook of my elbow. Her presence a solid anchor after so much drifting. We didn't even reach the elevators before the final collapse of Vance's empire began in earnest. Detectives intercepted Dr. Martin Shaw near the wood-paneled doors, his sterile mask of professional indifference finally shattering as they read him his rights. In the parking lot, the scene was even more chaotic. A second team cornered Vance Madden as he reached for the handle of his SUV. I watched from the top of the concrete steps, the distance offering a perspective I hadn't had in years. Vance Madden, you're under arrest for elder abuse, felony fraud, and witness intimidation, the officer barked. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the asphalt, a sound as final as a period at the end of a long, dark sentence. As they searched him, the lead detective pulled a slim slip of paper from Vance's breast pocket. It was a one-way ticket to Macau dated for tomorrow. The coward had intended to abandon Brooke the moment the wine was liquidated and the debts were settled. You'll never prove it. Vance screamed, his face a contorted mask of the charm he'd used to deceive us for so long. Handcuffs have a very specific sound. It's the sound of a lie finally hitting its limit. I watched them lead the wolves away in chains, their predatory confidence replaced by the stumbling gait of men who had run out of ground. The drive back to the vineyard felt shorter than the one to the courthouse, but the silence between us was different now. It was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. We reached the iron gates of Heritage Hills as the golden light of a Napa sunset began to bleed across the valley. Brooke helped me hang my heavy wool coat in the foyer, a small rhythmic gesture that signaled the restoration of my status as the master of my own home. Heritage Hills wasn't just land and grapes anymore. It was a fortress that had survived a siege, and its walls were stronger for the battle. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Brooke whispered, her voice thick with the weight of the last few weeks. "I almost let him take everything." I turned to her, placing my hands on her shoulders. "He didn't take the foundation, Brooke. And that's the only part that matters when you're building something to last." On the foyer table, I noticed a small envelope addressed in George Turner's rugged script. I opened it to find a single key and a set of coordinates. George had moved the missing crown jewel bottles to a secondary vault the very night the bailiffs took me to Meadowbrook. He had seen the fracture coming and protected the heart of the archive while I was being dismantled. We walked out to the back porch together, the scent of wet earth and winter vines rising to meet us. I looked at the rolling hills of my wife's dream, then at my daughter, and I realized the greatest vintage Rebecca ever curated wasn't in a bottle. It was standing right next to me. The kitchen was filled with the scent of rosemary and roasting turkey, a domestic warmth that felt like a hard-won miracle after the sterile, lemon-scented hallways of my recent past. I watched my daughter Brooke as she meticulously basted the bird, her movements possessing a fragile, careful grace as we navigated the space together for our first Thanksgiving alone. The soft pop of a cork had earlier signaled the start of our preparations, but it was the quiet shared between us that spoke of a life finally being celebrated. Brooke shared updates on her freelance business and the progress of her formal divorce, her voice steady now that the shadow of Vance was no longer cast across her drafting table. I revealed my own plan to turn the Heritage Hills estate into a non-profit archival museum for rare vintages, ensuring that Rebecca's fortress would become a sanctuary for others who appreciated liquid history. I told her then that Rebecca had secretly prepaid the mortgage on Brooke's design studio years ago, using a trust fund Vance never found, ensuring her independence was secure all along. "I never realized how much Mother did to make this house feel alive," Dad Brooke said, leaning against the counter. "I'm trying to find that rhythm again." I smiled, pulling a tray of roasted vegetables from the oven. "You aren't finding her rhythm, Brooke. You're building your own, and it's a solid foundation. Family is like a bridge under a heavy load. It's the invisible internal stresses that teach you where the structure is truly strong. We have endured the stress test, and the pylons are holding." I walked down to the cellar and brought up a dusty bottle of 1990 vintage, the year Brooke was born. The cork didn't crumble. It held just like we did. As we sat in the dining room, the warmth of the fireplace flickering against the walls, I opened Rebecca's journal to the corresponding entry. The handwriting was bright and unruly, much like the wine itself. She described this vintage as possessing a structure that would only improve with time and the right environment. "She saved this for the day you finally came home." I told Brooke, my voice thick with a profound, wise affection. "Not just to the house, but to yourself." Brooke took a sip, the deep garnet color of the wine catching the firelight. "It's beautiful, Dad. I can taste the sun on the vines, and I can taste her." As we toasted, I noticed a final unread note tucked into the very back of the journal's binding. Rebecca hadn't just intended for Brooke to be an heir. She had intended for her to be the head curator of the entire estate. As the last of the autumn light faded from the room, Brooke set her glass down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a child. "Dad, there's one more bottle on the list. One mother said we could only open when the last wolf was truly gone." The bite of the December wind through the open cellar doors was a reminder that while the wolves were gone, the work of winter and the work of a true garrison had only just begun. I stood on the threshold, watching the frost settle on the vineyard trellis like a fine layer of silver dust. After the chaos of the courthouse and the sterile silence of Meadowbrook, the smell of wet concrete and cedar in the main house foyer felt like a holy restoration. We didn't waste time. I used my expertise as a bridge inspector to oversee the reinforcement of the cellar's vaulted ceilings, the ring of a hammer against steel echoing through the subterranean hallways as we ensured the foundation was physically secure for the next century. Brooke took charge of the visual branding and digital cataloging of the 847 bottles. I would often see the flickering blue light of her laptop late into the night as she treated each handwritten label like a piece of high art. George managed the dormant vines, preparing the soil for a spring that would finally belong entirely to the family again. A museum isn't just a place to store things, Brooke, I told her, as we inspected a new mahogany rack. It's a structure built to hold the weight of memory. Cement and courage share a specific property. They both require time to cure before they can support the life built on top of them. I discovered that George had been secretly recording the environmental data of the cellar for 20 years, providing a scientific record that transformed our archive into the most authoritative wine database in the world. We worked through the holidays to install the Rebecca Garrison Memorial Library within the vault, a climate-controlled room dedicated to her journals. Nathan Hughes provided the initial funding and professional curators, turning my wife's private obsession into a public benefit. The wolves were in cages. The wine was in glass. The family was in focus. She didn't build this to keep people out, Thane Nathan said as we stood in the finished space. She built it to show them what's worth keeping in. Brooke then turned to me, the cold, tactile feel of archival paper in her hands. She revealed she had decided to move back to Napa permanently, to serve as the archive's executive director, fully embracing the role Rebecca had envisioned. The foundation was settled. The archive was ready. With the last crate of cataloged journals in place, I reached for the very back shelf, the spot Brooke had pointed out, and found the heritage bottle. Its wax seal was engraved with a date I had been dreading and dreaming of for 60 years, a vintage that carried the weight of my own birth and the promise of a final, unshakable peace. The television screen flickered with the cold, gray light of a courtroom 300 miles away, but the finality of the judge's voice felt like the closing of a vault door I'd been trying to lock for a lifetime. I sat in the library, the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace providing a comfort the sterile world of the law never could. Brooke stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, as we watched Vance Madden receive a sentence of 12 years for felony fraud and elder abuse. He looked small on the screen, stripped of the tailored suits and predatory charm he had used to try and dismantle our family. The broadcast also confirmed the permanent revocation of Dr. Martin Shaw's medical license, ensuring their engine of greed was truly dead. I felt no sudden surge of triumph, only a profound, quiet relief that the structural integrity of my life had been restored. A courier arrived shortly after the broadcast with a final letter from Vance's legal team, a pathetic attempt at an apology that felt more like a last-ditch effort for leniency. I didn't even break the seal. I walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the embers, refusing to let his voice enter this house one last time. 12 years. It's a long time for a man, but for a vine, it's barely a childhood. The noise was finally gone, replaced by a silence that no longer felt like a threat. The morning of my 60th birthday arrived with a sun so bright it made the dormant vines look like spun gold. I walked the rows with George Turner, the cold morning air crisp on my face. We reached the Cabernet block, just as the light hit the gnarled wood. Thane, look, George, said, his voice a gravelly whisper of awe. She always said the vines know exactly when the danger is over. I leaned in and saw at the first microscopic burst of vibrant green the bud break. Have you ever felt the weight of a ghost lift off your shoulders? It doesn't happen with a bang. It happens with a breath. I spent 60 years looking for cracks in things I told George, my voice reflecting a calm, wise serenity. It's about time I started looking for the growth instead. The vineyard wasn't a museum of what Rebecca was anymore. It was a living laboratory of what Brooke and I were becoming. We walked back to the cellar to retrieve the heritage bottle, the tactile weight of it, feeling like the final stone in a great cathedral. As I examined the wax seal under the cellar lights, I discovered a detail I had missed in the shadows of the previous months. Beside my own initials, Rebecca had engraved a second set, BG. She had known all along that we would be a team, that I wouldn't have to carry this legacy alone. I gripped the silver corkscrew, the metal biting into my palm with a welcome coldness, and looked at my daughter. Are you ready to see what she left us? The wax seal cracked with a sound like a single crisp footfall on frozen earth, releasing a bouquet of cedar dark fruit and 30 years of secrets into the cool air of the vault. I stood with Brooke in the heart of the newly inaugurated Garrison Archive, the silence of the cellar no longer a weight, but a sanctuary. I carefully removed the cork, the silver screw biting deep into the history Rebecca had curated for this very moment. I discovered that this 1966 vintage wasn't just a birth year bottle she had tracked down later in life. It was the very first bottle she had ever bought, long before we even moved to Napa or spoke of vineyards. It was the seed of the empire she had built in the shadows. I poured 2 glasses, the liquid a deep, vibrant amber that caught the soft LED glow of the vault. As I lifted the bottle back to its wooden crate, my fingers brushed against a small waterproof capsule tucked into a recessed corner. I opened it to find a small digital recorder. I pressed play, and the archive was suddenly filled with the voice that had been missing from my life for too long. Thane. If you are hearing this, it means the structure held. Rebecca's voice began sounding calm and wise, exactly as I remembered. My project wasn't just to save the wine, my love. It was to ensure that you had a reason to keep building bridges even after I was gone. I wanted you to have a span that connected our past to Brooke's future, to the architect of our lives. Brooke whispered, her eyes shining as she raised her glass. I looked at her, seeing the strength and clarity that had emerged from the wreckage of the last few months. She didn't just save the past. Brooke, I replied, the warmth of the wine spreading through me like a promise. She calculated the load-bearing capacity of our future. A legacy isn't a museum of what was lost. It's a bridge that carries the living across the waters of grief. We drank in a silence that was finally peaceful, a liquid celebration of a plan that had survived every storm Vance could throw at it. I realized then that the heritage bottle was actually a master's blend of both our birth years, a marriage of vintages that symbolized a bridge existing outside of time. I walked out onto the porch as the first guests for the museum's opening began to arrive in the distance, their headlights carving paths through the evening mist. I looked toward the horizon, where the lights of the distant bridges flickered over the water. I was no longer just a retired inspector of steel and concrete. I was the guardian of a different kind of span. The bridge is holding Rebecca, I whispered into the cool air. Every single cable, every rivet. I set my glass down on the railing, the taste of the 1966 still lingering like a warm promise against my palate. For the first time in 60 years, I didn't look for the cracks in the foundation or the rust on the supports. I didn't worry about the wolves or the debts or the lawyers. I just stood there in the golden twilight of my home, watching the lights flicker in the distance, knowing that the structural integrity of my family was finally and forever unshakable. Looking back at my own family story, I have to confront a truth that humbles me more than any courtroom ever could. I spent 40 years inspecting bridges for invisible fractures, measuring stress loads, calculating failure points, studying rust before it could spread. Yet inside my own home, I ignored the subtle cracks forming beneath polite dinners and quiet conversations. This family story is not only about betrayal, it is about blindness. I confused silence with stability. I mistook routine for security. I believed that if no one raised their voice, nothing was breaking. I was wrong. If there is anything worth carrying forward from this family story, it is this: never surrender your discernment in the name of keeping the peace. Evil rarely announces itself with a roar. It arrives with a smile, a handshake, and a reasonable explanation. It negotiates entry through trust. What many people labeled as dad revenge was never fueled by hatred. This dad revenge was about survival. It was about drawing a line when greed tried to rewrite my wife's legacy and erase my dignity. But let me be honest. Even necessary dad revenge carries consequences. I nearly lost my daughter because I confused endurance with wisdom. I thought patience alone would protect her. I failed to see that silence can sometimes empower the wrong person. Do not be like me. Ask uncomfortable questions. Protect your boundaries even when it feels impolite. Observe actions more carefully than you listen to promises. Love should never require blindness as proof of loyalty. Trust is sacred, but it must be supported by integrity. There were nights when everything felt engineered against me: legal documents, fabricated diagnoses, locked doors. In those moments, I held on to one thing I trusted: that the Lord's timing was greater than the wolves circling my fence. Faith did not remove the battle. It did not shorten the storm, but it steadied my hands when everything else trembled. It reminded me that character is forged under pressure, not comfort. Strength is rarely loud. Integrity is rarely dramatic. But both endure long after predators exhaust themselves. Thank you for walking beside me to the end of this journey. I would genuinely value your thoughts. What do you believe was the true turning point in this story? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this message resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. Please note, while inspired by real-world themes, certain elements were dramatized to deepen emotional impact and meaning.